To discuss all of this, let's bring in our panel. From Istanbul, Metin Gurcan is a security analyst and columnist for Al Monitor's Turkey Pulse. With us here in the studio, Negar Mortazavi is diplomatic correspondent for the Independent newspaper. Kamal Alam is a visiting fellow at the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security Studies. He joins us from London. And from Toronto, the political analyst Dmitry Frolovskiy joins us. Welcome to all of you. Metin Gurcan, let me start with you, and let me start with the point that our reporter just raised, and that is the formation of a committee to rewrite the constitution of Syria. And I'm wondering if this raises more questions than provides answers. How significant is this, and will Syrians be involved in this?
Yes, I mean, one of the solid outcomes of this summit is the formation of this constitutional committee. It had been a hotly discussed issue for almost a year because of Ankara some reservations about the members, some members of this committee and their alleged ties with PKK-affiliated YPG. At this summit, I think this problem resolved, and at the end we could see the formation of an 150 members, a committee involving 150 members. So this is an important juncture for the end of armed clashes and for the start of the political transition and constitution making in Syria. So that's why all parties, I mean, Moscow, Tehran, and Ankara has been very keen on this issue. And this initiative should be also coordinated with the Geneva process as well. So this is a clear outcome of this summit. But of course, there are still some cloudy issues. The very first issue in this constitutional committee is how this committee is going to work. And the main question, overall question that they should tackle is whether they will have an initiative to modify or to revise existing Syrian constitution, right, or to write a new, totally new constitution. Yeah, Metin, so this is the question still lingering.
Yeah, Metin, I'm also wondering, I mean, isn't the other big challenge is to get everybody to sign on to this?
Yeah, that's right, that's right. I mean, that's why many people in Ankara is saying that with the formation of the constitutional committee, the hard part is over, but harder part has just started. Okay. So that's why this is very, very fragile process. But we will see at the end of the day. I mean, it's very good for us at least to get a constitutional committee marking the end of armed clashes in Syria and a hope for initiation for the political transition process.
All right, let me bring in Kamal Alam. He's in London. Kamal, you've been quoted by Al Jazeera as saying that the creation of this committee doesn't actually change anything on the ground. Explain that to us.
So I think, as a colleague in Istanbul said, it's important in terms of moving forward because there was no agreement previously and Ankara had reservations. But I think the ground reality is not changed because whilst there is an agreement on who is or who isn't on the Constitutional Committee, the Constitution has evolved over the last few years anyway. And as far as the Syrian government is concerned, it's an important step forward, but the groups which are outside of Syria, they will not really be party to this. And the groups in Idlib are still questionable. So their membership, whilst is real, what they can actually bring on the table will be limited, especially when the government has 70% of the territory and looking to take the rest of Idlib. And once the rest of Idlib falls, then those groups perhaps will not have a say on the committee. However, cosmetically speaking, it's an important step because at least there's agreement now and there are no more divisions on this.
Dmitry Frolovskiy, there are some experts who believe that this is a big victory for Russia, this summit that just took place, because it essentially legitimizes the government of Bashar al-Assad. Do you agree?
I would agree with that, but I would also say that it's a big victory for Iran as well, because although we've seen an attempt to remove Bashar al-Assad and change the regime in Syria, none of this attempt has succeeded. And at the same time, we see that with Bashar al-Assad staying in power, we also see an empowerment of Iran in the greater Levant territory. So I would agree, and I would say yes, for both Russia and Iran, it's a victory.
Negar, what does the agreement do for Iran's presence in the region? Will the Iranian negotiators be go home saying, well, look, we've achieved what we came here to do. The United States has been neutralized, and there's now backing for our side in this.
I don't think that will happen anytime soon. Now, Iran's presence in Syria has somehow decreased in the past very recent months, and we see that Bashar al-Assad has gotten even stronger, if not weaker, and that's definitely, I agree with your other guest, that's definitely a victory for Iran. And we have to remember that Syria is basically Iran's gateway to the Arab world. It's their closest, sometimes only Arab ally in the region. It's also what Iran calls part of the axis of resistance. And basically with the common enemy, which is Israel. So these are all very strategic partnerships that Iran and Syria have had over decades. It's not a new thing. That's why Iran was not, willing to let go of Bashar al-Assad in power. And it seems like they have succeeded along with Russia in trying to keep Assad in power. But at the same time, there is, at least along the more moderate factions in Iran, there has been a will and messaging coming that they wanted to see less violence and some form of a political solution out of this Syria war. I think it's a good step in the right direction. We still have to wait and see if it actually happens. But anything that reduces the violence, and it seems like Bashar al-Assad is not going away anytime soon, is probably any political solution towards the end of the war would be a good step. And the other concern I wanted to also mention that Iran has had has always been the issue of the Islamic State and terrorism, which is something that's not only a propaganda message that's coming from Iran. It's an actual concern that even the Iranian population shares with the government as far as Iran's presence in Syria.
Metin Gurcan, there was also another development, this was about a month ago, when Turkey and the United States made a separate agreement to establish a joint operations center to manage a buffer zone. This would be to manage the refugees that Turkey fears would actually go into Turkey if there was more violence in Idlib. What happens now to that buffer zone? Is the United States still play a role in that?
Yeah, I mean, this is an important question. I mean, let me start with this first. I mean, the timing of this summit is extremely important for Turkey, at least to get the full support of Moscow and Tehran in Ankara's plan for the establishment of safe zones in the northeast of Syria with the cooperation of the United States. So Ankara has two objectives for that. First one is to diminish military capabilities of PKK-affiliated YPG groups in northeast of Syria with these safe zones. And the second objective for Ankara is to transfer at least some Syrian refugees currently living in Turkey to these safe places, and then to start their rehabilitation and reintegration process. So at this summit, Ankara was hoping for getting support of Tehran and Moscow, but I would say a knowledgeable source in Ankara said to me that in this summit, Ankara could get 30% of what she desired. And then in this 30%, I would say at least silence of Tehran and Moscow. They are not openly declining this offer of creation of safe zone in the northeast of Syria is a message for hope for Ankara. I would say like that. And also Mr. Erdogan's emphasis on the meeting in the United Nations next week. And he will likely have a meeting with Mr. Trump. Yeah. And if he can't get what he wanted, and he hinted that at the beginning of October, Ankara would move unilaterally to establish those safe zones. So in this sense, if Ankara cannot get a green light from US, at least a full consent, then Ankara should turn her face to Moscow and Tehran for the full support of this initiative. But at the end of the day, their silence at the summit, I would say, will be has been received as a kind of tacit endorsement. But we will see.
Okay. Negar, of course, the United States was not at the summit. The Iranian president, actually, Hassan Rouhani, had some very harsh words for the United States. Let's watch. Let's see what he said there.
U.S. presence in the region is an invasive, illegal and interfering one, continuously keeping this part of the Syrian region unsafe. If we want to establish real security in the region, the only way is that the U.S. invasion to the region should be over.
Was it part of the Iranian goal to exclude, to isolate the United States completely?
Well, as much as they can, because of course Iran is the only party in all of this that has the worst or any lack of relationship with the U.S. And there's also simultaneous tensions between Tehran and Washington happening, of course. If Mr. Erdogan is going to meet President Trump, Mr. Rouhani is probably not going to meet President Trump on the silence of the UN. So Iran has opposed the presence and the influence of U.S. in Syria. And quite frankly, I don't think the influence of U.S. in Syria has been as successful as the United States has wanted. It's one of those areas that, there's still a lot of disagreement in Washington as what they should have done, they could have done, and if they could have done anything. So, and also I think one more issue that we have to remember for Iran is that the issue of refugees is not something that Tehran is much worried about. As your colleague was talking about Turkey, that's a bigger, more pressing issue for Turkey. Tehran and Moscow don't have that concern for refugees. So whatever happens as far as details on that, I don't think matters too much to Tehran if there's an agreement between Turkey and U.S., as long as it doesn't threaten the the strength of the central government in Damascus and Bashar al-Assad power, basically.
Dmitry, President Putin was also very scathing in his assessment of the United States' role in Syria. This is what he had to say. Let's listen.
As for the deployment of the U.S. armed forces, their presence on Syrian territory is illegal. Everyone knows it very well. We will proceed from the fact that the decision by the U.S. President Trump to withdraw the U.S. troops will be implemented, and they will accomplish it.
So what is President Putin's game plan here, Dmitry, in terms of where and how he sees a role for the United States?
I think President Putin has been quite consistent in his position, and he's been saying, I think, that since 2014, that the U.S. presence in Syria is illegal, while Russia's presence was authorized by the legitimate Syrian government. So I think Moscow will do everything possible to achieve as much withdrawal of the U.S. troops from Syria as possible. And in many ways, I think we see that actually correlates with the White House current position on Syria, and Trump is keen on withdrawing, diminishing American influence in the Middle East and getting troops back home. So I think in that sense, we have a very interesting situation right now when both Moscow and Washington actually want the same thing. So let's see.
That's right. President Trump has adopted a very non-interventionist policy towards the Middle East. Kamal, you wrote an article in which you said the United States is completely irrelevant to Syria's future and has, in fact, been irrelevant since it pulled out of Lebanon in the 1980s. Can you expand on that for us?
Yes, absolutely. I think when this war started, if you look at the senior former U.S. diplomats who were dealing with Syria and the Cold War, at the top being Henry Kissinger, then Zbigniew Brzezinski, the two most influential men for U.S. policy in this Cold War. They said, do not touch Syria to Obama because we've never had any say there, and the Syrians are very tricky customers. We tried our best. Bill Clinton said the same thing in his memoirs when he tried very hard to negotiate with Hafez al-Assad. Everyone knows with a famous meeting which went on for hours and hours. So yes, the U.S. have had very little say in Syria, historically speaking. Damascus has been the one capital that's never been under American influence post-1950s, who tried to intervene, and they failed because they did not know the exact mechanics of Syria, how Syria ruled Lebanon, how Syria has influence over the Arab-Israeli conflict, and indeed Iraq. Because whilst people say Syria was a proxy of Iran, if you look at a close reading, in Iraq, the Syrian government has always backed groups that are against Iran. And this is why the Americans kept accusing Syria of backing the Sunni groups. So that's why the US had very little to do in terms of influencing the conflict. Russia has been the historical ally going back 4 decades, and there are other countries, including Iran, of course, that have been more influential.
Yeah, but Kamal, looking at the situation right now in Syria, what happens to the US Kurdish allies once the United States withdraws?
I think that will be the key, really, how the Americans negotiate with Turkey, how the Russians negotiate with Turkey. Of course, Turkey is very clear it will not tolerate any sort of group on its border which has links to terrorists, as the YPG do. At the same time, Syria is very clear that they view the SDF and YPG forces as terrorists if they are infringing upon a sovereign and legitimate state. So that could be something that brings Ankara and Damascus together. And let's not forget, Turkey and Syria had a very close security partnership before this war began. Once Bashar al-Assad became president, Turkey and Syria had a complete rapprochement and had a security partnership which led to cooperation on the Kurdish file. So that's the only thing that could perhaps have some sort of cooperation between Turkey and Syria, which the Russians are trying to do. That will probably decide what happens in the northeast of Syria with regards to any sort of semi-autonomous group within the northeast, which Syria don't want, neither do Turkey.
Metin Gurcan, as our reporter pointed out in her report, she said that Turkey is playing host right now to 3.5 million Syrian refugees. And Turkey, of course, also fears there could be a new exodus of refugees if the violence in Idlib doesn't stop soon. Now, I'm wondering how this plays into domestic Turkish politics, because some analysts say it's the refugee question that cost President Erdogan's party the election in Istanbul just a few months ago.
Yep, I totally agree with this argument. I mean, Turkey has been hosting these Syrian refugees for almost 5 years. But up until 6 months ago, it was not a problem in Turkish society. But currently, as parallel with the deteriorating economic conditions in Turkey and particularly poor segments and lower middle class segments of the society has been feeling this economic crisis in a much more comprehensive fashion, as parallel with their feeling of this economic crisis. Right now, people are complaining about all these Syrian refugees, and I totally agree to this argument that this anti-Syrian refugee sentiment getting increasingly visible in Turkey and becoming a major issue at the domestic politics has costed a lot to Mr. Erdogan, losing the rerun election in 23rd of June, Istanbul election. I think it was one of the prime factors of this political defeat. So that's why, so as to control this increasingly visible anti-Syrian refugee sentiment in Turkey, Mr. Erdogan is so inclined to speak about transfer of some, let's say, 800,000 or 1 million Syrians to the north of Syria, and then to reintegrate and to rehabilitate them. But all this means a very, very comprehensive post-conflict reconstruction effort. Yeah. And then we are talking about around 800,000 people at least. So who will finance all these efforts? This is the key issue. Ankara has been looking for an answer. And at the summit, I am sure that this question has been asked widely. But neither Moscow nor Tehran is so inclined to answer this question. So that's why all eyes in Ankara seemingly turn to Europe and European countries, at least to finance all these efforts.
Kamal, how big a concern is it in Europe, in Western Europe, if there are more refugees, if Turkey opens its borders to more refugees? Because as we've seen in the past, the issue of refugees is a pretty volatile issue in domestic European politics, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think it's a big issue. One could argue that if you look at the Syrian war and how the refugee crisis unfolded a few years ago, it led to a direct rise of some of the uber-nationalist parties in Europe. Greece, of course, has already issued loads of emergency warnings in the last few weeks. If there are more refugees coming in, they won't be able to cope. Italy have obviously said that as well. So I think there is a concern in Europe that they just can't cope with any more refugees. And at the same time, Turkey's like, well, we are dealing with it, and we don't want to be the only country. So I think that's somewhere where Europe will need to support Turkey, because Turkey certainly has been burdened with it without the support that was promised to it over the years.
Does it give President Erdogan something of a bargaining chip, Kamal, when dealing with the Europeans?
I think so, yes. He's saying, look, if you don't support us, we can't hold the fort forever. We have other issues and other priorities as well. And especially given that he has had electoral defeats recently, it's a big issue for him. So there's only so much he can do. And I think he's reaching out to the Europeans and saying that, you know, our patience is being tested and we need support on this. And I think this is where, especially for the Eastern Mediterranean, there will at some point need to be some kind of dialogue which includes Damascus as well, because without that it'll be hard for Turkey. And the Greeks and Italians have shown some inclination to talk directly to the Syrian government. So overall they would need a strategy, because even for the safe zone to come in, Turkey can do it, of course, they have the military might to do it, but they would need diplomatic support within the region as well.
Dmitry, of course, Russia has been playing a big role in Syria, in the region. Question is, why is Syria so important for Russia's strategic regional interests?
It's actually a pretty big question to answer, if we would, because in that sense we would have to go way back to the 90s when the Russian role in the Middle East started to decline. But if we look at what's happened, what's been happening in the region in Russia in the past 5 years, then on the one hand we see that there is a dramatic deterioration in relation with the West. There is this fiasco in eastern Ukraine. And at the same time, there is a need for Russia to emerge as a global power on the international arena. At the same time, Russia still believes that that it has to play a big role in the Middle East, and it's kind of afraid that, and was afraid that if Syria was left alone, then the Gulf monarchies such as Qatar would have just built a pipeline there to Europe, which would crowd out Russia's share in the European markets. So it's pretty complicated question to answer, but from my perspective, it's primarily to get a stronghold in the Middle East, to have an influence in the region, and also to preserve access to European energy markets, and to show to the West mostly that Russia is a global power and it's capable to fix Syria.
Negar, looking at the view from here, from Washington, President Trump has said, as we we mentioned this earlier, that he wants to pull US troops out of Syria. He is a non-interventionist president. Now that John Bolton, his very hawkish national security advisor, is gone, is that going to happen sooner rather than later?
It still matters what the military commanders around President Trump advise and how much pull they have. John Bolton is gone, but President Trump is still surrounded by hawks like Mike Pompeo and the others who have, continued the mantle. And we've seen that in the rhetoric against Iran and the policy that still continues. But I think Syria is one of the least problems of President Trump in the Middle East right now. He's entangled in all of this withdrawal or peace talks in Afghanistan. He's still worried about the presence in the ongoing war in Iraq. So this is not something that we hear a lot President Trump discussing here in Washington. So I think if the talks with Iran, Russia, and Turkey continue and yield some results, it's probably for the benefit of everyone, including President Trump's White House. But again, without the U.S. also being part of the final solution, I don't think it can completely solidify whatever happens in Syria on the ground. So at some point, the U.S. has to have some kind of involvement in all of this as well.
Metin, very quickly, we've just got a few seconds left. So the summit's taken place. We now have the agreement on the formation of this committee to rewrite the constitution. What happens next?
Yeah, I mean, then we have to wait for the next Astana summit to be held in Nur-Sultan or Astana of Kazakhstan in late October. I think in this summit we will hear more about how this constitutional committee is gonna work, and which kind of issues they will raise at this summit. But as I said before, the very first thing that they should tackle is modifying or revision of the existing constitution, or start with writing totally new constitution. So this is the key issue that they should ask, whether this constitutional committee can find a kind of independent stance to proceed.
Okay. Thank you to all of you for being with us. We have to end it there. That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America, or visit us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.